So this talk is about the book that I'm writing, and I start out with this observation about the research on digital labor. So as Jack Chu, Melissa Gregg, and Kate Crawford write, the last 15 years have seen an expansion of the studies on the relationship between labor and the information and communication technology, what they call ICTs. While there has been a distinct turn to labor in ICT research, the scholarship remains disconnected and fragmented across disciplines. So what they're saying is that this turn to invisible labor made labor visible and unhid hidden labor a while ago. It's not a new thing. So while there are these juicy demystifications and scandals about Foxconn workers and gold farmers and people getting their data taken, this is actually kind of old news. Jenna Burrell's book, Invisible Users, about internet cafe people in Ghana, really doesn't say they're invisible, it just says they're marginalized, right? It just says they're not important. Vicky Mayer's Below the Line illuminates the hidden labor of people who not only produce things the industry needs, but also produce themselves in the service of capital expansion. And so I'm very inspired by this idea, not of whether labor is hidden or not, but who is doing it and what kind of formation ensues for this. So if even the Washington Post knows that hidden labor is hidden, it's not hidden anymore. So journalism has finally caught up with this scam. Right? And Tiziana Terranova was writing about this over 10 years ago in Free Labor, so now everybody knows, right? It's not a secret anymore. Trevor Schultz's book, Digital Labor, collected in 2013, also unhides this labor. So I'm going to read something from Schultz, which I really love. He says, "Social life on the internet has become the standing reserve, the site for the creation of value through ever more inscrutable channels of commercial surveillance." So, Heidegger. What does it mean when every remnant of social life itself is deployed rather than reserved? So I take the term to deploy in its military fashion, right? And so as Rick showed in his image of women using cameras to make movies, women are deployed in times when war takes men out of the workforce, right? So who is and who is not deployed? What can be reserved? Craig Wilsey writes in The Value of Homelessness, Managing Surplus Life in the United States, that surplus populations such as hobos, women, the homeless, people of color who have had historical relations to unfree labor, in short, who have been slaves or indentured workers, had once been this standing reserve, who had been called back into service as workers when needed and then could seamlessly be transitioned out. However, as Rod Ferguson writes, partly because of advances that Norbert Wiener knew were going to happen, the automation of labor of judgment as well as labor of the body, these workers will never not be in reserve. They are not assimilable back, except as a resource within the prison industrial complex. Right, so Margaret Atwood has a great book out now. I think you should. I'm not going to spoil it too bad by telling you. It's about a time when jobs are so scarce that people get jobs by being prisoners. Right, so that's the use, the deployment of that surplus labor to make labor for someone else, which is to say criminologists, prison guards, social workers, and so on. And that's Wilsey's claim. So if we put these two readings of Heidegger together, standing reserve as surplus populations, marginalized people, standing reserve as labor, which is extracted from us in the form of likes, but also gameplay, using social media, it's clear that we're not all in the same boat. Right, I think this headline makes it seem this way, we're all. However, this is not true. We are not all equally permitted to work at all times. We're not all equally concerned with survival. And in Workers Without Bodies, I'm interested specifically in digital labor performed by workers whose bodies make their work deviant. In other words, the labor itself is not deviant, but when it's performed by, say, Chinese prisoners or Chinese workers making gold in World of Warcraft, it's seen as criminal. And producers of commodities that not only improves the value of their platforms, but are sometimes ambivalent additions to platforms that lay bare the stakes of survival for some kinds of work. So I'm not going to get to talk about it very much, but I was very interested in call-out culture. In other words, women of color who went on a social media strike, saying that constantly fighting against all the trolls and abusers and people who say they want to kill them is hard work, it's unwaged work. They see it as valuable work for survival, and I think that's really important. So if I had more time, I'd be calling back to Audre Lorde, because she has a reading of electronics manufacture, which I found totally surprising and cool that she had this. So I'm going to talk about this a little bit. We are not all the same. We do not all have the same resort to identity-based politics that vivified and limited feminism, third world liberation movements, and so on. In an information economy, there are those whose knowledge, whose subjugated knowledge, whose quantified selves, whose data are given and nothing is received in return. Perhaps nothing of theirs is wanted except for these bodies as forms of labor. So I take to heart women of color feminism as a way to answer this because I think we have been here before. This is Audre Lorde. Maybe the most iconic image of her. In 1982, Audre Lorde gave a speech at Harvard on Malcolm X weekend addressing Harvard students, and this was the year before Donna Haraway published the Cyborg Manifesto. So it's around the same time that Haraway is thinking about the nimble fingers of Asian women, which are making all of the techno-science devices which are making it possible and necessary to have the conversation about the cyborg as a possibility. And so I'll read it because I love Audre Lorde so much. Survival is not a theory. In what way do I contribute to the subjugation of any part of those I define as my people? And that's a broad thing for Audre Lorde. Insight must illuminate the particulars of our lives. Who labors to make the bread we waste, or the energy it takes to make nuclear poisons which will not biodegrade for 1,000 years, or who goes blind assembling the microtransistors in our inexpensive calculators? So this was part of the woman of color agenda, was to think about the material base of subjugation. And specifically to give this at Harvard, I think, is quite a gesture, right? So again, like interesting convergence between Lorde and Haraway. And so I'm going to move to something else that's happening in this post-war period. From 1965 to 1975, over 1,000 Navajo women and men worked at Microscopes manufacturing integrated circuits for the Fairchild Corporation, which was the largest employer of Native Americans in the US at that time. Annual reports from the company, and here's one, showed how their work was interpolated and celebrated as cultural preservation work. So this appears right after this image. It's the 6040 chip that the people at the Fairchild Company were making. It went into the Apollo, it went to the calculators that Audre Lorde's talking about, right? Maybe not the exact calculators, but still, transistor radios, really early game consoles like the Channel F from Fairchild. So I'm just gonna page through this and make a really quick argument about how this may be the first moment in which creative digital labor is interpolated and celebrated as cultural preservation work. Right? So standing at a microscope, looking at chips, tiny chips made by hand. Again, this idea that cyborg labor is robot labor. It's not human labor done by hand is really given the lie here. And I think this brochure does a wonderful job of showing how affective work is supposed to be its own reward, right? That Indians naturally make these things anyway, and so why not? What a wonderful use of free labor. Now, obviously, Indians in this plant were making less than minimum wage because it was not a part of the U.S. So they could make far, far less than U.S. citizens were allowed to make. Labor laws did not apply to them. So the brochure makes the visual argument that rugs are a different material iteration of the same aesthetic tradition found in the integrated circuit, right? That this is not extra work. The opening page says, the blending of innate Navajo skill and semiconductors' precision assembly techniques has made the Shiprock plant one of Fairchild's best facilities, not just in terms of production, but in terms of quality as well. So here's a picture of Raymond Nakai, who is the chief of Navajo Nation at that time, who worked really hard to get this plant on his land because it was the only jobs there were. So if people wanted cash, there was no way for them to get it except to bring industry onto the reservation. So here he is giving a rug to David Rockefeller to celebrate the opening of this plant. And he was very excited about the notion of rebranding Navajo people as technological. So in a place where premature death is absolutely common, uranium mining, really, really everywhere, Navajo people in 1965 to 1975 were trying to create a futurity that involved a kind of a racial preservation of a dying resource, which is their own culture, through technological means and a rebranding as the technological Indians. So this is the making of an indigenous futurity through industry. To tell a long story in a really quick way, this plant was closed in 1975 when the American Indian movement came and shut it down because they wanted to unionize it. And to this day, the electronics industry has never been unionized, which is why we have so much cheap stuff, right? Alan Kay and his his colleagues really need this to be the case for them to do what they do. If it weren't for that, we couldn't have any of that, right? So I'm going to move in a very telegraphic way to talk more about Norbert Wiener, who we've talked about a couple times today. In 1950, in the first edition and most idealistic edition of The Human Use of Human Beings, he said, quote, "Let us remember that the automatic machine, whatever we may think of its feelings, any feelings it may or may not have, is the precise economic equivalent of slave labor. Any labor which competes with slave labor must accept the economic conditions of slave labor." So here is a story which I think is really emblematic of labor or pay for play in our contemporary moment. In 2008, 20% of World of Warcraft's 8 to 10 million players had purchased in-game gold. That's a lot of people, that's a lot of gold. Most of that gold was farmed or created or played for by people in China who were often in what's called kind of sweated conditions. They were under tons of pressure, often sleeping, kind of in these massive bunks and playing as hard as possible. Social science scholars call this deviant play. They call it criminal play. Of course, they say nothing about the people who buy this gold. They do it to get ahead in the game and to make it more fun for themselves. So survival means taking on the affective burden of game boredom, of doing someone else's grinding, of taking the most addictive and fun digital media of all and experiencing it in sweated conditions. It's a short step from this kind of labor in unfree conditions to slavery, the original free labor. So I think there's a lot of critique of free labor as reproductive labor women were doing at first. It's true, women were doing a lot of unpaid labor, but I think in this country, free labor really does mean slave labor, right? It's labor which is forced and compelled and not waged, right? And not seen as labor, so that's the original invisible labor, if you ask me. All right, so moving on. And these are chapters in my book. They will become clear someday. I was very interested in platform cooperativism arising out of women of color's labor, and specifically out of the Kitchen Table Press Collective, because they're a good example of what I call kind of fragile collective, right? So this Bridge Called My Back has many Tumblr fans. I was following that scene. It was really interesting. And I claim that the labor of distribution, of creation, and nurturing of cultural knowledge arises from an early form of what we would call platform cooperativism now, that is to say, the not-for-profit, feminist-owned, and feminist-run press. So that would be Persephone Press, which was a publisher of this Bridge Called My Back. Before that, or after that, Kitchen Table Press. This book, this Bridge Called My Back, was out of print for 10 years. And it is an absolutely essential canonical book. It was out of print. And where people were finding it was Tumblr. There was a massive fandom around it. So Barbara Smith said in 1989, the reason they wanted to make Kitchen Table Press was because they realized that controlling the distribution channel was just as important as controlling the content, right? Which is something we might think of today. So they wanted to contribute their free labor. Because they had no alternative, they knew that the people they wanted to publish had no access to the mechanism for getting published. And they did not want to be, quote, at the mercy or whim of others. However, what happened, of course, is that they weren't able to sustain themselves. They weren't really a big mainstream press. So what happened when this Bridge Called My Back went out of print is you could find it on Tumblr, and it was so interesting how it was framed. So people tell each other they have to get this book. It's not an option. It's for survival, right? And they say to each other, it is a rare find and it might be expensive. Went out of print in 2002. It went back in print this year in 2015, but for lots of reasons, there are people who still can't afford it. I think it's $30. So it's more gettable, but I think in 2014, I took some screenshots to show you how expensive it was. So it was a lot. They were valuable, they were pretty rare, as this person says. They were not easy to get, especially new copies, mint copies, a couple $100 sometimes. So they're expensive. And looking at Tumblr, you could see how many women wanted to celebrate the acquisition of this rare thing. One of their pictures taken with it said how they cried when they got it. Some people got it as gifts from friends, found it at Goodwill, cried, were totally moved. Said it's the most beautiful thing I've ever gotten. It's a hardly marked copy. This person is posing on the bed with it. There are a lot of bed shots with this book. And I think it may have to do with dorms, or it may just have to do with, like, this is the space of the feminine or the domestic, right? Here's this book, which is part of my life, and which I have in the bed. Another person showing off their trophy, right? This classic woman of color text, which was signed by somebody. This is another Tumblr trope, book with glasses. I see this lots of times. Again, like, this is part of my life. This is a tableau I'm preparing for you. It's an essential woman of color text. And here's another picture. Someone clearly got this from a library where it was remaindered. So when Rick said, the things that get pulped are often the things that we need the most, absolutely. Right? Lots of people had library copies of this. But libraries just said, nope, don't need it anymore, and here it is. And here's another copy of this. I cried a lot. So this is affective media, really, really strongly so. People are really clear about it. And so I want to talk about the kind of enframing of this culture of insurgent woman of color knowledge distribution. So I found some pages on Tumblr that talk about where it came from, the kind of collective labor of making it, of versioning it, of cleaning it, of making sure that it stays up, of making sure that it's got the right bits in it, and enjoy it and share it everywhere. The opposite to Amazon, exactly the opposite. So fuck yeah, radical literature, right? It's one of those Tumblrs that does that job. And here's another one which I just love. Right? So Tumblr doesn't host PDFs. You have to make links to places that do. So Mediafire was the place that had these books. But Tumblr is a place where you can make links to anything, which kind of lets them be harmless as copyright violators. And so I found a conversation on Tumblr about the book. For a while it wasn't available, and people were saying, where is it? What happened to it? And so there are often replies about the book that if you have a copy and you're willing to put it up, please do. Like, we need to keep this up. It's really important cultural knowledge. And here's a screenshot from what SUNY Press has. This is the brand new edition, which shows, the price now. So again, it's available now legally. The price has gone down now that it's available legally. Still, I think it's important to think about excuses or reasons or alibis or actually really important reasons why it might be all right to share it that way. So I'm going to talk really quickly about women of color call-out culture, and I'm going to do it through talking about some horrible things that happened to women this year. So you might recognize this person. It's Zoe Quinn. In 2014, she released a game called Depression Quest, which is very good, but she started getting phone calls saying, oh, I saw your game on Greenlight, and I hope you kill yourself. On February 11th, 2011, or February 8th, 2011, an Xbox Live player sent a message to a female player with whom he just played a game of Call of Duty reading, "You fat fucking tomboy, go kill yourself." And this is not unusual in 1994, as Julian DeBell describes in his great, great article, A Rape in Cyberspace, quote, "A woman in Haverford, Pennsylvania, whose account attached her to a character she called Starsinger was given an asked-for opportunity to read the words. As if against her will, Starsinger jabs a steak knife up her ass, causing immense joy. You hear Mr. Bungle laughing evilly in the distance." So I'm very interested in this trope of women being told to kill themselves while playing games online. And I think it can be read through women of color feminism, particularly Grace Hong's work and Cherry Moraga's work, because the U.S. Census reminds us women of color in the U.S. simply do not live as long as other people in the U.S. Being a woman of color, intellectual, artist, or activist, a person whose life work is to bridge this killing gap with their art, expression, feeling, connection, play, hastens rather than mitigates premature death. In her new preface to the 2014 edition of this bridge, or 2015, which I just showed you, Cherry Moraga writes about this too, saying that when she was putting the book together, she was amazed by how many of the original contributors were dead. So she said, she had noticed since the first edition, the premature and in some cases violent deaths of so many of the book's contributors testify to the indisputable fact of the daily threat to women of color lives. It also speaks to the profound cost of just being us. So Grace Hong writes about this in her tribute to Barbara Christian, giving a long list of women of color academics who had died very young. And she calls out the dangers that Black feminists face as intellectuals and writers in the academy for the labor of calling out theorizing and engaging with sexism and racism in public, in the classroom, at the academy. As she puts it, quote, "It is shocking to say and impossible to prove that these women suffered early deaths because their battles around race, gender, and sexuality were being waged so directly on and through their bodies. Yet the names bear witness to this unknowable truth." So it is hazardous to be a woman of color intellectual who is paid to call out racism and sexism in the US. It is also hazardous to be a person in digital space whose passionate work identifying, calling out, and acting as a moderator or mediator between different spaces of privilege occurs on top of wage labor for free. So that one, sorry. So in the longer version, I talk about how in AOL's early culture, they basically got people to do this for free. So to enforce terms of service, to make sure people were being nice to each other, that they knew how to use the affordances. They basically socialized them into being users, but they also turned them into a very valuable commodity, which is subscribers, right? So they were pastoralized as feminine workers. They were not held on. The engineers were all kept. These people were all fired. And so, as Terra Nova and lots of people have written, they did eventually get paid, but it was a long time, right? It was when HuffPo was being sold to AOL or vice versa. It was around this time anyway. So I just finished a chapter on an insurgent move called This Tweet Called My Back, which again, like it's so interesting how women of color feminism is kind of really mobilizing, I think, as a way to talk about digital labor, because it's always been good at talking about not just invisible labor, marginalized labor, criminalized labor, but embodied labor, right? So labor which is immiserated, labor which is not seen as labor, and labor which is compelled, and labor which is killing labor, right? So I was very interested in this movement, and I just took one quote out from here to talk about a little bit, which is their acquisition of labor consciousness as women of color intellectual workers, who they say, and which I think there's lots of reason to believe, are losing life, right? If life is the thing that we're talking about here, and that's what Audre Lorde was really concerned with in the end, what they're saying here is that we must find a way to protect the spaces that we have and to continue to live our lives in digital space, which others get to do as well. But we also have to think about the toll this is taking. Will we have to crowdfund our bills in middle age because we're unwaged? So I'm just going to read this last paragraph really quick. So, sorry. All right. So, as Gail DeCosnick writes of fan labor, for many fans, a donation of labor is willingly given in exchange for the opportunity to enjoy and play in a relatively open, unrestricted internet. So I write about those who willingly give their labor in exchange for survival, for freedom, but also those who give it reluctantly or maybe do not want to give it at all, in exchange for safety, survival, that is generated by the production of freedom for a different group's freedom, the open, unrestricted internet. So just to unpack this, in order for there to be something which people can experience as open, unrestricted, some people have to give of themselves, right? Give of their bodies, their time, and their lives so that there can be discourse, right? So as Schultz says, authors in his book were thinking about own wage labor, monetized labor, and he talked about his grandmother, who he said was a home worker all her life, and that it's hard to talk about labor that doesn't feel, smell, or look like labor at all. So the labor I'm talking about, indigenous manufacture, ooh, I'm done. Okay, so just to say that this labor is illegal, traumatic, and vital. However, the idea of the good life as a reward for entrepreneurial self-production is not mutually exclusive, right? There's still a notion that this is a possibility. So if you have more questions, feel free to ask, and part of this will appear in an article.